I care about in love, but wait. Maybe I'm getting too emotional. That's exactly what they say you ain't supposed to do. Suppress your feelings, never talk about your pain. Can't appreciate the sun without acknowledging it rains, right? That's right. So this a moment of clarity. And make sure you always protect your energy. You stay focused and your life gon' be lit. And you are now rocking with Celeste, the therapist. Let's go.
Hi, beautiful people. So if you have never been in here before, thank you so much for being here. My name is Celeste. I'm a therapist from Boston. I come on, I talk to people that are doing things to empower the lives of others by sharing their story. So this is a live podcast. I have a podcast looks just like this, Celeste Davis Podcast. I've been podcasting since July 2nd, 2018, which means tomorrow is going to be 2 years. I just realized it yesterday when I was saying it out loud on the show. Hi, Derek. Hi, Galatians. Wow, I haven't seen you in a long time. How are you? So, hi, Miss Deb. So, I've been podcasting since July 2018. And I just so happened, today's my last day live podcasting until September. And it just so happens that tomorrow is the 2 year anniversary. So, I'm super excited. It's been a blast. It's really been a blast. Hi. It's been a blast. I started on Periscope. So right now we're streaming on Facebook, Periscope, and YouTube. And so a lot of my listeners and people that have been following me from Periscope days when I used to go live before the podcast. So it's been a great journey, and I couldn't be where I'm at today without amazing guests and without people that share my episode and listen to the things that we talk about. And so I'm grateful to you guys for that. So it's Minority Mental Health Awareness Month, which is amazing. But anybody who's been following me know that I believe in talking about mental health 365 days of the year. But I cannot leave this season or this time. I'm going to be gone for 2 months, gone on podcasts. But if you follow me on social media, you'll be able to stay connected. I can't leave without talking about everything that's going on and, how it affects our mental health. And so I no better person to do that. I'm going to have him introduce himself to you guys. I'm adding to the stream. Hello. Can you introduce yourself to my audience?
Celeste, what's up? What's up, everybody? Ricky Grant Jr., Boston native and resident, currently the Chief of Community Engagement for the Suffolk County DA's office, and a pastor in the city of Boston. Celeste, glad to be on with you. I'm glad I made the roster before you go on break.
All right. I'm excited that you're here and to have this conversation. So one of the things that I believe in, and I believe in shifting the way people think by conversation. I think conversation is important. A lot of times the way that we have learned to think has been kind of ingrained in us growing up. And for me personally, I grew up in church. I'm curious about kind of your upbringing, if you grew up in church as well.
Yeah. So definitely grew up in church. So I remember just as far back as I can remember, my family was attending, at the time it was called New Covenant Christian Church. It's in Mattapan, 1500 Blue Hill Ave, really big church. The name changed to Jubilee as I was there. And then I left from there probably when I was 21. But in terms of being shaped in church and where I was shaped in the gospel, it was there.
Okay, yeah. And that's the same for me. I grew up in church, and not just church, but even when I think about school, I think church was a big part of my life. When I think about school, I just thought, we were living our life and we were all equal. Is that something that you kind of do you grow up in the hood? Where did you grow up at in Boston?
So I grew up in Roxbury.
Okay.
I grew up on Rockland Street.
Okay.
Between St. Joseph and Warren Gardens. But I had a unique experience because, of course, every day I was experiencing the hood. I had a crack house that was right to the right of my grandmother's house that I grew up in. But then from 4th grade to 9th grade, I was going to Metco. And so Metco was this program in Boston where they take you from the city and send you to suburban schools for quote unquote better education. So I was going to Wellesley from fourth grade to ninth grade. So I was getting a dual experience for years where I was experiencing life in a hood and what that was like, and then going every day out to a school where there was affluent neighborhoods and which was mostly white people, which was a completely culture shock to me every single day I was going out there. So I experienced, I would say, both sides of the coin from fourth grade to ninth grade, being both in Roxbury and then going out to Wellesley as well.
When you were going out to Wellesley, so for my listeners that are not from Boston area, Wellesley is a really affluent place where the,
Absolutely.
and also, and another note, and this is something that I learned a couple years ago, the income range and the Boston, and when it comes to Black and brown people, is really different. It's
staggering.
It's
staggering.
It's nowhere. It's not even like this. It's just like this and like this.
Yeah, well, I mean, to be exact, it's $247,000 for your average white family in terms of net worth versus $8 for your average Black family.
Yeah,
like you do all the assets, you do the liability. That's what we're looking at in Boston in terms of the average net income, in terms of what you are worth for white families versus Black families. It's staggering and it's scary.
So now you're growing up next to a crack house, and then you start going to a whole nother, seems like a whole nother area. Do you remember what you thought during that time? Did you think like, wow, why can't I have that? Or why do they have this and I don't?
Yeah, I distinctly remember, I just remember feeling like this is what rich must feel like. You know what I'm saying? I distinctly remember, at the time I'm living in an apartment. And so when you would go out to school, you would also get a host family. And so that host family was typically a white family that lived in Wellesley. And so when you would stay after school, sometimes you would go and stay with that host family. And so I'm at homes that look like mansions to me, right? There's a yard to run in. You know what I'm saying? Up where we're from, you don't even necessarily have a yard with grass to run in. So there were many things. I think most of what I felt though was shame. I think I felt the shame for that. There were times when the host family would drive you home. And so when they would drive me home, when we would go back, when I would have to come back to reality, coming from Wellesley back around the way, I remember feeling ashamed that my family didn't have what my boy Max and his family had out in Wellesley. And so I think most of what I felt and what I was cognizant of at the time was I knew I didn't have what they had, and I was comfortable hanging out until they had to come and see my space. That would produce a sense of shame for me pretty often, actually.
Okay, and then so after ninth grade, you went back to school in Boston.
So after ninth grade, I went back to school in Boston because by that point I had gotten tired of the commute. So I'm leaving very, very early when it's dark. I'm coming back every day when it's dark. And so after a while, I wasn't even experiencing my neighborhood anymore because when I was getting home at night, I was trying to go in the crib and then, do homework. And so I remember actually within myself feeling a sense of nervousness in my own community as the years went on. That alarmed me. Like, how can I be nervous where I grew up at? But and so I remember advocating for myself in the ninth grade for my parents to allow me to come back. I ended up finishing at North Cambridge Catholic, which had a lot of Boston students that, I played ball. So a lot of guys who were from around the way was going there playing ball. And that was much more my context in my neighborhood. And I got to kind of reacclimate myself through high school, kind of back into the neighborhood life and just feeling comfortable around my own people.
Okay, so that's good. Now, we both of us kind of grew up the same way. I didn't have that MECO experience. When I was about 15, I went to school in Georgia, and I was able to go to school with other white people, but we were still in the same socioeconomic status, so it didn't feel different. And now I want to move forward to my first kind of like awakening of my reality, right? So I'm growing up in the hood. I figure out how to get to college. I'm taking out all these loans, and I'm just kind of like struggling, but surviving, not living. And I'm in college. I'm getting my master's. Usually, I was the only Black person there. But then I learned about this word called white privilege, right? And so I didn't understand what that meant. I remember I spoke to Dave Capozzi. You and I know Dave Capozzi. We were working together. He's a white man. He's a white male. And I said, like, what does that? I don't understand. What is white privilege? Like, How
Mm,
how is it that it's white people's fault that they are privileged? Like I had the
mm,
same mindset that white people tend to have around like their race. And then so that happened, and it was around and then Trayvon Martin happened, and
mm,
then not just that it happened, but then the result of what happened started
mm.
to really like shake me up a little bit around the reality in America. I'm curious about like your reality and when things started to shift. A little bit sounds like the
Yeah.
metro, but then what happened later that made you start to think differently?
Yeah, so I would say probably my first brazen encounter with racism that I can remember. I remember being in the fourth grade. I remember this white kid named Timmy. I think we must have been so before school would start. We would kind of have a recess before school and then one during the middle of the day. So this is the one before school. We're out there playing with balls or whatever, and I must have frustrated him in some way. And I remember him calling me "you stupid black boy." And I remember I must have been at the time I was in the fourth grade, and I just remember my blood running cold, right? And then I'm attacking the kid. My friend has to come and grab me and stop me. So that was kind of my first experience. I think honestly though, Celeste, like it hasn't been until I would probably say, you as you're growing up in life and as you're in school, you hear about the disparities, you hear about the inequities. So you have pockets of knowledge, right? Based on stories you hear about ancestors and the civil rights movement. So you have pockets. But I think that it was in my 30s. As my kids started to get older, I have a 15-year-old, a 14-year-old, and a 6-year-old. I had children. I had been married for a while. I had worked really hard. I had a degree. I had done a lot of things just like you. And yet the poverty and the struggle continued to seem to be there. Um, and I think that was when I started to start paying attention to ways that the system was just built to keep people in poverty. And as I looked at my school loans and just different ways that in order for me to obtain a better job, you say I got to get a degree, but in order for me to get a degree, I got to go into debt. And so I started to realize these systems that were at play. And then when you start to look at the numbers, right? So some of the work that I've done as directors and executive directors, I had to start looking at data and looking at numbers around inequities. And when you start to look at the numbers, whether you're looking at housing or whether you're looking at education or whether you're looking at even health. There was a study that came out in 2018 that was done by the feds. It was called "The Color of Money in Boston." And one of the most, I mean, that article is probably the scariest story. Like, forget going to get a fiction and forget going to a horror movie. Just read that article. And it said that the life expectancy of a black person living in Roxbury was 30 years younger than a white person living in the South End. It went literally from 58 years old, jumped to like 90 years old. And so when you're talking about almost within a mile. And so when you begin to, when the numbers started to hit me, it woke me up. It woke me up like when I saw George Floyd get murdered. It woke me up. It forced me to wake up out of a slumber and realize that in this country, there's something systemically and there's something structurally going on that literally breeds outcomes that continue to oppress and suppress the progress of
Yeah.
black people. And so that's those kinds of things begin to wake me up.
Yeah, and then so for people listening, when he discusses the life expectancy, it's not about crime. A lot of things are factored into it. There's health.
Absolutely.
There's so many other things that there's the environment, the way and Chelsea, or it's a town in Massachusetts where there's trucks going in and out.
Yep.
The people, they have more cases of COVID because of the air quality,
Right.
right? So there's
Right.
so many
You're talking about
different
the
factors,
environment. You're talking
right?
about access to clean and healthy food. We're talking about to the
Health
stressors that
services.
black people go through. All of those kinds of things, they pile up, and the accumulation is a 30-year different life expectancy with those two neighborhoods, which is just staggering and alarming.
One of the things that you just kind of talked about as well is, the things that you learn about in school. So you got the civil rights movement, you got, signing a declaration that we're free, all of these things that are happening. And hearing about that in school made me feel that I was doing well because I was no longer in chains.
Right.
When is it that you started to understand, like, the housing systems and the redlining and the prison, school to prison pipeline? Like, how was that awakening for
Right.
you?
So my journey in terms of my career has been working with families, primarily working with young people. And so in particular, it's been working with high risk young people, right? Or at risk young people or proven risk young people. So these are youth and young adults who have either been involved with the system, maybe it's DCS, maybe it's DYS, right? Maybe there's some kind of gang involvement. And so, in a lot of the jobs that I worked, by the time I got involved with them, we needed to create kind of, some alternative ways to figure out how are these young people, how are these young adults going to create a life for themselves, because the one decision they made at 17 is going to impede their ability to get a job. That Corey's going to impede their ability to get a job. So as I was working with families and young people, and you have to advocate on their behalf and try to get them services, you start to realize the roadblocks. Because I don't have a record. By God's grace, I don't have a record, right? I should, but I don't have one. And so personally, I didn't have to deal with the, hey, I got to put on this job application that, I have a felony. I never had to do that. But as I begin to serve and work alongside families and youth and young adults that had those particular challenges, and then you have to try to navigate on their behalf, I started to realize how much of a barrier and how difficult and how much the struggle was to get your life from a poor decision that you made. Now you want to get your life on point, and just how many barriers stood in their way. That's just kind of just one example of what that was, but that was what awoke in me, right? Because I had just been fortunate in some ways where there were certain things that I hadn't experienced. But as I began to work with families and young people and young adults, that was when I started to realize the different barriers that people were up against. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that they were Black people, and the fact that the system is just bent towards, for example, when you look at, when you think about Corey's, and it's the fact that you have to identify on it that you have a felony, right? Like that disproportionately is impacting people of color when they have to identify that. So that's just one of many, many examples systemically where when Black people want to make progress, right, or try to make progress, that there is something often in their way standing there that's going to serve as a barrier. And even sometimes with the greatest internal fortitude, one of the things that we see with our brothers and sisters is that sometimes things do not end well, even with all the hard work, even with trying to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Thank God for those of us who things break our way and we're able to do that. But by and large, these systems are meant to keep us marginalized, and for the most part, they do.
Yeah, and you're right. And so, as the listeners, you're hearing about me and Ricky's kind of journey on kind of learning about America and the things we were taught in school were not the reality. It was what they taught us what they wanted us to learn. And
can I just jump in? I'll just say this too. When you think about this, Celeste, and you think about us learning about Christopher Columbus, right? When we're growing up and we're learning social studies, the first thing that we have no idea about when we're reading the Constitution is we have no idea that the Constitution never viewed Black people as human beings, right? So as we're sitting there in school learning about the Constitution, we don't even realize at that time that we weren't even considered human beings. What we were considered was property. Yeah. We were considered property, right? That's unbelievable. When we hear about the Emancipation Proclamation, what you don't hear that, okay, well, once we became free, that the current president gave us no land, right? There were hundreds and millions of land being given away to the poor European, but to the African, there was none, right? MLK asked the question in 1968, why has every other immigrant population been successful in America, but not Black people? And he said, well, what other immigrant population has been slaves on this soil for 246 years and another 140 years of unjust laws? He's like, that'll do it to you. And then when the Emancipation Proclamation comes, rather than giving us land, you give it away to the poor European, and we have to be indentured servants back to the same masters that used to own us. Those are the kinds of things that we're coming through school that we're not aware of. But as you continue to grow and learn, you realize that at every turn, whether we're talking about Black Wall Street, they say, come on, just work hard. We work hard. We have our own buildings, our own churches, and it takes one accusation from one white girl as justification to murder Black women, Black men, Black children. We've seen this country blow up Philadelphia. We've seen it drop bombs in Detroit. We see it drop bombs in Los Angeles. And so the kinds of things that have happened to Black people in this country, as you continue to grow and learn and become woke and become awake, you start to realize that, wow, this is not about a bad apple. This is about a culture and a system and a structure that has made Black people second-class citizens at best, that has made them the property of America in order to continue to build an economy off of us. And it's unfortunate, but that's the reality that we're living in.
Mm-hmm. And so you're absolutely right. And when I think about the reality for us and the reality for people that are not Black, right? So the people who struggle with understanding, I always say, like, you really don't want to understand because the information's out there. And I get it. Like, if I grew up in privilege and I've been comfortable my whole life, it'd be hard for me to want to step on that territory to like open
Absolutely.
my eyes and see the reality of the fact that, like, this all this money I have, this is blood money, right? Talk to people a little bit about like that part of the system in which people that are not Black, white people may struggle with understanding and coming to
Right.
that reality.
So no, thanks for the question. So one of the things that I like to say is I think it's very important how we onboard conversations, and I always say this: we can't step to white people saying you're a racist. You should know you're a racist and accept you're a racist. Like, it just doesn't work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I liken this conversation to when I began getting challenged around masculinity, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
probably about 2 years ago, I started this journey around really inspecting masculinity because toxic masculinity became a term that was kind of a hot topic. And I started learning from sisters that were around me. It challenged me, and I realized that although my first reaction to the term toxic masculinity, I had a deep aversion to it. I had to push past that initial aversion, lean into it, and really try to understand what my sisters were saying to me because I just did not have their context, right? And so what it required of me was some humility, and it required patience. And so one of the things that I would say to my white brothers and sisters, right, is I know that the conversation around race probably isn't always onboarded for you in a way that tastes good, right? No doubt. Like, but it's hard to have tact when you're talking about 400 plus years of brutality, right? And so what I would encourage my white brothers and sisters to do is to continue to take a posture of humility and continue to take a posture of trying to learn, because what you don't have that Black people have is you just don't have our perspective,
Mm-hmm.
right? You don't have our experience. And so I don't blame white people for being ignorant about racism. I don't blame white people for feeling defensive when we term them as racist. But with that being said, and the reason why I bring up the masculinity piece is because of how much I struggled with it. Just the other day, we was having a conversation about masculinity on Facebook, and two of my friends just washed me down and just had to correct me. You know what I'm saying? Because I just had such a blind spot as a man that I needed other men who were more enlightened than me in that topic and sisters to literally walk me through. And though there were times when I wanted to be defensive, I pushed back past that and lean into it. So one of the first things I would say to white people is to check that part of yourself that don't want to hear it. Deal with that part of yourself that doesn't want to be challenged. Just acknowledge it. And it's okay that it's there, because the same thing happens with all of us in different areas of life. But because of humanity, right, for us to make this world and this life a better place, not only for us, but our children and our children's children, to lean into it and to really listen to what Black people are saying. And the other thing I would say is to white people is this, just if you look at, but the reason why the first thing you got to deal with is your own offense, is because if you can't deal with that first, you won't be able to hear, no matter how obvious the numbers might be. Just think about this, Celeste. You're talking about 1964, 1965. You're talking about Black people just get a Civil Rights Act passed. Just get a Voting Rights Act passed. It had been 100 years since the Emancipation Proclamation, right? But in terms of Black people literally feeling what it was to have rights, didn't happen until then. And then even after the civil rights and the voting rights, right, you still had states trying to resist, put in litmus tests and these kind of tests to keep people from voting until the federal government has to come in and say, we passed the law, you have to listen to it. And so it has been a fight, tooth and nail. You look at the Jim Crow laws. And the other thing about America that white people need to understand is this: white people hear legal and think good. Black people hear legal and think terror. Because the things that have been done under legality to us has been, slavery was legal, Jim Crow was legal, mass incarceration now is legal. Here's the thing, right? Celeste, you think about in the 1970s, you're talking about 300,000 people in prison, right? Mm-hmm. When we get to the 2000s, 2010, 2015, you're talking about 2.3, 2.4 million people in 2016. Right now, here's what's odd about it. You would think to yourself, the Civil Rights Movement passed, okay, the Voting Rights Act passed, okay, Okay, so the brutalization of black people is about to go down. We ain't gonna be locking up more black and brown people. We not gonna have that. And the exact opposite happened, right? Because then we had presidents talking about the war on crime and the war on drugs, and we criminalized black communities. We took our fathers, we took our uncles, we took our brothers, we brutalized to the point where Michelle Alexander right now, who wrote the author of the New Jim Crow, in her book says that there are 3 million more adult black women in this country than adult black men. Just think about that. Just think about that. I said it to somebody the other day and they said to myself, Rick, that can't be true. I mean, I believe Michelle. And so it just shows you from the 1970s all the way to 2016 what has been done. So now we live in the mass incarceration age. We are still not out of the brutalization of black people. So for white people, it's just understanding these things are facts. They're not anecdotal. It's not a case of a bad apple. We're talking about a culture and a system and a structure. And I saw a question come up to say, well, how can we fix it? Part of fixing it is understanding it. Right? Like we live, like I know we want to be like solution driven, but until we understand the veracity of it, there's no fixing it. Until we come to an understanding of how diabolical it is, there's no fixing it. And so before we jump to, because part of I want to fix it sometime, but I'll pause right there. Go ahead. Let me not jump into that. Go ahead.
No, it's all right, Pastor. You know, so everything you're saying makes sense, and I want to think about solutions. I want to think about what that looks like or what that even means. But I want to move on to now we're in this pandemic. COVID happens, and America starts to see this disparities. You have the health guy. What's his name?
Fauci. Yep, Dr. Fauci.
Talking about, yep. He named it. He said, you know, it's racist. You could not name it, right? You could not name it. And so that happens, and we see in this. And so it's, you know, like we're grappling with that, right? We're still going to work, and we're like a lot of people in the communities that you talk about are dying, and now so we're in our homes, and then George Floyd happens, right? And prior to George Floyd, we've seen things, right, where people were murdered by police. But then we've seen that this was different, right? This was different. The lady who did Selma, what's her name? The black lady with the locks.
Who did what? Say again.
Selma. She was the director of Selma, and she did When They See Us. But
okay. I don't know. I know. Yes. I know. I got the picture. Yes.
Duvernay said this was different. You had both people's. You had the officer and you had George Floyd's face in there, right? You've seen him pleading for his life, and you've seen the police officer just kind of casually kill him.
Yeah.
You know, and so I started. Thank you, Ava DuVernay. Thank you, guys. And so I started thinking about how many other murders happened with no camera, right? Because the way that happened, this was another day at work for him. This was another day at work. And so that bothered me so much to my core. But what really made me start to, and again, I feel like I do my part. I talk about mental health, and I want people to be educated about that. But what really made me like push forward and start to really like go deep head into racism is when my 9-year-old son comes downstairs and tells me that he just watched on YouTube George Floyd get murdered, and why did this happen? You know, and then and I'm having to explain this to him, right? Because it's different now. It's not a newspaper that we're picking up. Me and you're the same age. We grew up in the ages of newspapers, and I'm having to explain to him. And he asked me like, well, will we ever be slaves again? As I'm telling him about the history and things like that. And so I said to myself, like, I can't not do anything anymore. I can't not say anything anymore, right?
Right.
So I'm just curious about like George Floyd happens, and does that rock you, or what does that do for you?
Yeah. So George Floyd dying, it broke my heart. I tell people that when I watched George Floyd die that week, whatever remaining pretense I had, whatever deference I had remaining for anything that even remotely resembled white supremacy, it died with George. It died with him. you know, there's so much that you said that can be responded to. When you think about Derek Chauvin, the cop who killed him, you think about 18 and 19 infractions prior to that. You think about multiple police-involved shootings. And this is why we have a policy battle raging in this country right now, right? Because how could it be that a person with 19 infractions was allowed to be out there in the field, right, dealing with residents?
He's a criminal.
He's a criminal, and he's literally a danger. Here's what I say about George Floyd. Watching George Floyd die was our generation's Emmett Till. And the reason why I say that is because when Emmett Till was brutalized and drowned and beaten beyond human recognition, you would think that his mother would say, let's close the casket. I don't want anyone to remember my son that way. And Mamie did something that was very bold, and she forced America and the world to look at what they had done to her son. And it woke the world up, right? We had white allies come as a result of that. In reality, it wasn't Rosa Parks being arrested off the bus that sparked the civil rights movement. It was Mamie Till saying, look at what they have done to my son. That was what got the wheels turning. And I think when you look at the response from black people, when you look at protesting all over this country, you look at rioting all over this country, you look at our bold politicians, our district attorneys and city councilors and state senators and Congress people all over this country who are fighting tooth and nail, our U.S. senators who are fighting tooth and nail to get legislation passed that'll bring about equity in our country. It woke everybody up. It woke everybody up. It woke everybody up. And I think that the brazen nature in which George Floyd died, right? Here's what I've been saying too, Celeste. Like, America is not changing or has not made changes because America's coming to a great awakening. America's only changed because it's gotten shamed into changing. That's it. And that's a fact. Okay? When MLK decided that him and those young people would do direct action, right? Direct non-violent action, as they're getting hosed and chewed on by dogs and dragged out of restaurants, right? He's making a spectacle of America. He's shaming America. And eventually you see MLK in an office with President Lyndon Johnson talking about civil rights and voting act. It was because America was shamed into changing. And this is the thing that black people need to understand, and all white allies need to understand too. This is not going to happen because we're going to have nice conversation and the world's going to change. This is going to happen because we run down on people, right? That we have our own mob mentality. I'm not talking about being violent, but that when it comes to protesting, we protest. When it comes to changing legislation, we change legislation. When it comes to continuing to have these conversations to uplift what is going on. And so there's so many different avenues to get involved. But what all of us need to realize once we watch George Floyd was, it was almost like, I don't know, Celeste, if you ever had a conversation with somebody and it's something that's kind of like hiding under tow, right? And then finally that person gets pissed off enough to say to you what they have been wanting to say the whole time. when Derek Chauvin did that, right? It was so, what we see in the aftermath of bodies hanging, 10 to 12 bodies found lynched from May 31st to June 10th. When we think about the car that pulled up and killed that young lady as she was at a stoplight, when we continue to see the mass amounts of videos that come out every day where white people got to go back and say, oops, I'm sorry, I got to apologize. It's because the soul of America is being exposed. The soul of America, it's like when you drank too much and you got to throw up. America's throwing up. White people don't know how to deal with it because really what's been happening with them is they really have been believing and internalizing that they are superior to black folks, right? And now that it's being exposed and they're being held accountable for it, a part of me almost feels bad for them because I'm like, y'all all losing y'all jobs because here's the thing about white supremacy and racism. It doesn't just dehumanize black people, it dehumanizes white people. When you believe, right, that within God's creation, that you are superior to the rest of the creation, human beings that God made, you already find yourself in a space where you are anti-God, right? You already find your space where you are defying the creative order of God who made all human beings in his image. And so racism and white supremacy, all social constructs that devalue any group of people, it harms all of us. It harms the group perpetrating it, and it harms the group who's on the receiving end of it. And we need to abandon all of it. And what we need to do when we talk about what are the answers is fighting for the equity of all people. I'm not just interested in fighting for equity for black people because I don't want it to be black people on top and now other people are struggling. No, what we want is a world where there is equity, right? Where there is equality, where we all have the same value, all have the same access, and all have the same opportunities.
Good. That's good. And you bring up this white supremacy word. I want to go into how, because we started with talking about church, and when I learned more of the history, and I think about how the slave masters allowed us to have church on Sundays, and was a big, church was a big part of, is still a big part of the African American culture. What part of the evangelical church plays a role in what's happening today? Because I see a lot. One of the pastors, I wish I had his name. We should call it white blessing. The privilege
Pastor, yeah, Giglio or Giglio, yeah,
yeah,
I saw
I
that.
mean, like the fact that you said that, like, it says a lot, So I'm thinking about like how much church, which this country is faith. They say we love God, which is why
No doubt,
we don't want
no
abortions, but
doubt,
we could put people in cages.
no
So
doubt.
so what part of that do you think plays a role in what's
So,
happening?
the church and the white church in particular play a huge. Unfortunately, the white church plays an incredibly large role in what's going on with this country. Because check this out: when you are going to dehumanize a group of people, you need some kind of philosophy to justify it. You really do. You need a philosophy to justify it. And so there were two theological issues. I'm not going to bore y'all with this, but I just have to say this, right? There's two big theological issues. I'm actually going to be dealing with this on a panel tomorrow night. So the first theological issue that white people have to deal with is the way that they understand sovereignty and providence, right? So these words are used to describe the fact that God is basically the cause of all things. At the end of the day, he's either passively or actively involved. And in the end, you can say God is responsible for all things, right? And so there's a popular theologian from the 1500s named John Calvin. Much of the theology within white evangelicalism, it comes from his thought and idea. And he was a huge proponent of using violence for people who were not a part of his theological disposition, right? And so this is important because, so let me go back and say this. If I'm a white person, right, and I interpret God's sovereignty and providence as all things happen because of him, how can I not believe that God has brought about slavery?
Mm-hmm.
I must believe that God in his sovereignty and God in his providence is the one who has brought about slavery, right? And so we have to deal with that. Theologically, we have to deal with that, because as long as you think, right, and I'll be honest, I'll say this, right? The reason why Pastor Giglio came out and said white blessing, I had a conversation with a friend who's a white pastor the other day, and this is what he said to me, Celeste. He said, hey, Rick, I think I got it. I said, all right, tell me. He's like, okay, so white people had white privilege and all this stuff, and now God's in his sovereignty positioned us, right, so that now we could go back and help black people. I said, no, bro, you can't tell white people that God sovereignly used a racist, wicked, demonic system to position y'all so that now you can help black people, because what that's going to lead you from is racism to paternalism, right? Y'all going to go from being racist to being white saviors, and both are problematic, right? So we've got to deal with the way that we understand sovereignty. What is God's involvement in this? That must be answered. And what I believe is, I also believe in God's sovereignty and God's providence, but in this way. I believe that God sovereignly, that when he said, I'm making human beings in my image and my likeness, I believe that there was a level of autonomy that God gave to human beings so that their choices have real consequences in this life. I do not, because here's the thing. If I say that God is involved in every single thing, I must make God responsible for human trafficking. I must make God responsible for what happened to Breonna Taylor. I must make God responsible for what happened with George Floyd, right? And what much of evangelicalism will tell you is that though we can't understand it, this is to the glory of God. Well, I can't accept that. I can't accept 400 plus years of abuse as something that's to the glory of God, right? And so that's a huge theological issue that we need to deal with. It's that a lot of white people believe that God made them supreme. And I can take you to Genesis 1 and a lot of other passages that let you know that is actually a lie and it's satanic. That's one. And the second thing I'll say too, in terms of theological issues, is we have an issue around authority of scripture. I always ask people this: how can you get slavery from Christianity? There's only one way. The only way to get slavery from Christianity is by making the Bible a smorgasbord or a menu or as a collection of sayings, and I can choose from it whatever I want. But if Jesus is the Lord, like the Bible says, you can never get to slavery because Jesus never endorses it. Yes, Moses talks about it as a social construct that Israel had implemented, right? But Jesus never endorses it. The way Jesus says that we are to relate to one another, right, is that we love one another, right? Jesus never endorses that. You can never get slavery from that. The other thing that I'll say, and the last thing I'll say about this, I'm probably boring people with this theology.
No, you're good.
There's a conversation that Jesus has in Matthew 19 around marriage. The men in Israel have been divorcing their wives, basically writing them certificates of divorce because the bed ain't made and the chicken is cold, right? And Jesus confronted them. And they said, Jesus, why are you confronting us? Moses, let us do this. In the law, Moses said, as long as we write them a certificate of divorce, we good. Then we can go grab us another one. And Jesus said this about Moses' laws. He said, yeah, Moses did say that, but he said it as a concession because your hearts is hard. But that ain't really what it's about. And many, many times, Jesus made himself the chief interpreter of the law, right? The book of Hebrews argues that you know who's supreme over everybody? Moses, angels, everybody? Jesus. And then when we come to the Bible, the words that should have the most weight, even beyond the prophets, even beyond Paul, should be Jesus. And if that was the case, you would never get to slavery. But as long as Jesus is on par and Moses is as authoritative as Jesus and Paul is as authoritative of Jesus, I can justify a lot of things. But the Bible and the center of the Bible is about Jesus. Jesus rose from the dead in Luke 24 and said, I told you everything written in the law and the Psalms and the prophets were written about me must be fulfilled. He places himself at the center of the narrative of Scripture. Jesus' voice should be lifted up over every voice, and we never get to justifying slavery. But this country has treated the Bible like a lot of us do. It's just a smorgasbord of things that I can pull and choose, and whenever I conveniently want to choose it, I choose it.
Yeah, that's good.
I'm sorry, y'all. Listen, y'all, I'm sorry for that long theological explanation, but
nah, that was good. I you know, one of the things you said a couple of times today was that, you know, we can make anything make sense, whether we're talking about racism or anything we're trying to justify. We can make it make sense, and that's literally what America has done over the years. And you know, it makes sense why people have sucked up that mindset around it. So you know, before we go, I do want to talk about like what's next. Like, what does you know, I say solution, but I know nothing's going to change tomorrow. But like, what does it look like, or what does change look like? Because I do feel that this atmosphere, this energy that I'm in and that I'm experiencing is different. I start to think about my you know, the people before me, and I think about the civil rights movement, and I feel like, wow, this is what is re-happening over again, and I'm a part of it. It's interesting because, you know, growing up in church, I think about the people, you know, enslaved Moses, leading them to the promised land, and I would say, like, man, how does somebody wait that long? And then I started thinking about my history, and I said, we've been waiting that long. Like, we've been waiting that long, and we just didn't know it. I didn't know. I remember reading that growing up, and I'm just like, I'm literally in that same system that was before. And so I really want to like have a conversation around like, what does moving forward look like for not just for Black people, but for our white allies as well.
Ask me that last part one more time, Celeste.
What does moving forward look like? Not just for.
What does it look like?
Yeah, moving forward.
Yeah. So I think a couple things, and I think that it's hard to be completely descriptive because I think all of us are at different stages in our journey, and so I think number one is being committed to being a learner. I would say number one is that, right? Because one of the best things that we can do, Celeste, is really, really learn and understand the issues in such a way that we can intelligently and eloquently, right, and be able to articulate these points to our families, members, our friends. And so one of the things I would say is committing to continue to be a learner. The second thing I would do is go by your local congressperson's page your local city councilor, your local state senator, your local U.S. senator, right? And go and look at the policy and the legislations that they are putting forward, right? Your city councilor represents where you live specifically. They're putting forth legislation that's gonna impact you and your family members, right? You want to know, what are they proposing? What is the legislation? What's the conversation right now? You want to be involved on that level. The other thing that's going on is in your neighborhoods, there are civic associations. Find out, where is the civic association? When do they meet? What are the topics that are being discussed? So here's the thing, y'all, right? One of the reasons why in Celeste, I'm going to, starting in September, I'm going to finish my master's in policy. And the reason why I'm going to do it is because one of the things we need to realize is every part of life is governed by policy. Every restaurant we walk into, every business, there are a set of rules and laws that are called policies that govern the way it functions, right? When we look at Starbucks sending home workers that had Black Lives Matter masks, right? That's policy stuff. Like why were they able to do that? That's policy stuff. And so we need to be aware and plugged into how the world works. And the world works through policy. The world works through legislation. These are the kinds of laws that govern our land, right? And so we just need to be involved. We need to be aware. We need to be awake. I would encourage you, your local newspapers, you need to be a subscriber to them. You know, I'm a subscriber to the Globe. I read it every day. I read the Herald too, though they get on my nerves sometimes. But we need to understand what is going on in real time, right? The last thing I'll say is this, Celeste. Just this past week in Boston, we had the fiscal year for Massachusetts begin July 1st every fiscal year, right? And so we had a big thing come up where how is it 3.2 billion that the city of Boston has? How is that money going to be allocated? One of the saddest things about last week as this conversation was ongoing was that much of the community was unaware of what was going on, right? Just didn't know that, the fiscal, like how this budget's about to function is going to govern where funding's going to go for the next year in the city of Boston. And we just weren't aware. So one of the things, I will say this too, check me out at rickygrahamjr.com. But one of the things I'm going to try to put together, Celeste, as I'm working on my show as well, is we'll have some shows around civic engagement. I have panelists come on to really walk us through what do we need to be aware of? What do we need to be mindful of? But just these little instructions that I gave right now would really help us tremendously to understand the context, the social context with which we're living, understand the policy and legislation is being moved forward and how we can be a part of that. So those are just some of the things that I would say. But yeah, you just put it up here, rickygrahamjr.com. Check me out, y'all. I'm there. I'm there. That's my website.
No, that's good. So just a quick recap: education, legislation, civic association, plugging into how the world works. These are really great things that we can all tap into. Our white allies and Black people. I think it's important for us to know what's available. Protesting is one of many ways. And so don't feel as if because you can't get out in the streets that you can't do anything. Because I feel like there's always something that we can do, right? Absolutely.
And it's really just, listen, at the end of the day, if all I do myself is become informed, and as a result of becoming informed, I now live differently and I move a certain type of way. I just want to say to my white brothers and sisters, that's a win, right? And what makes me compassionate to the struggle that they have is that I'm struggling through this masculinity thing, right? I have a lot of growing to do. I've been a man for 38 years. You know what I'm saying? Like, and growing up where we grew up too. Hey, Abs. And growing up where we grew up too, I grew up with certain values that I had to realize over time. I'm like, oh snaps, that's toxic. Not crying, not this, not that. That ain't doing it. So I'm compassionate towards my white brothers, and I would just say, when it comes to masculinity, Celeste, I'm learning, but I'm actively learning. I'm not being passive, and I'm not making excuses. And what I would say to my white brothers and sisters is, don't be passive about understanding, and don't make excuses, right? Because harm is harm. And what makes us human, what makes our humanity worth something, is that we don't make excuses for the harm that we cause, but we actively work on it.
No, yeah, that's good. And knowing that this is not going to end tomorrow, right? I started this broadcast off talking about the fact that this is Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. And I'm so glad I had you on to have this dialogue because you're very solution oriented. Like there's a lot of emotion that we both are
Yeah.
experiencing, being that we are part of the people that have struggled, right? There's a lot of emotion that we're experiencing, but we still are able to put some logic into it. I know that's a struggle, when
Word.
you think about everything
Word.
that you go through, or the things that the people that you work with go through. But
Word.
I really want people to be cognizant and mindful of what they're feeling, how they're being affected, what they're
Word.
allowing in their life. Even if it's social media, now it's not just a 24, 48-hour news cycle. It's always in your face. But if you need to
Always.
take a break from it, like, I encourage you to take a break from it. Like, he said legislation, you can like go on your local government's website, and
Word.
you can tap into what's happening and still
Right.
do your part. Just because you're not, you don't have to like keep looking at what's happening to do your part. And I think I really wanted to kind of convey that message for people
Yeah.
that are struggling.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the last thing I would say, Celeste, is that we don't want white guilt. We want white accomplices, right?
Hmm.
And we want people who. Here's the reality, right? Like, if I'm a white person and I see what's going on in terms of systemic racism and structural racism in this country, what offends me is, as a human being, I'm associated with that. As a
Yeah.
white human being, I'm associated with that. And as a human being, I got a problem with that, right? Like,
Hmm.
I don't even have the gumption to defend, because I'm like, yo, that's evil. And my ancestors was a part of that. And so it's just, and again, the reason why I love to bring up this masculinity piece is because it's the only way for me to contextualize for white people that I understand what you're feeling.
Hmm.
Because I was raised and bred a certain way for, hold on, Bubba, yep, that's yours, for a certain amount of time. And
Hmm.
now, as I'm far into my manhood, I'm 30 something, it's like, yo, bro, some of that's toxic and you need to change. That's difficult. So I understand, but here's the thing. If it matters to me who I am as a human being in this world and how my life is impacting other lives, then I must make myself responsible for the fact that there are parts of masculinity that have been harmful to sisters and harmful to me, right? In the same
Hmm.
way, white brothers and sisters got to take responsibility that racism, right, has been harmful to black people and harmful to them, and must commit to doing everything that they can to improving themselves. If we just improve ourselves, Celeste, we will make this world better. If we just get
Absolutely.
dedicated to saying that, listen, I'm not going to move how I move. Maybe I would have been silent before about some injustice that I saw, but I won't be silent. That
Yeah.
right there is going to impact and transform lives and transform our own lives.
Yes, yes, absolutely. That was a good word. I appreciate you coming on, and making space, for people listening. RickyGrantJr.com. Is there a way for people to subscribe if they go there?
So listen, you'll go to the website, but listen, my YouTube, my Twitter, all that is Ricky Grant Jr. So subscribe on
Okay.
the YouTube. The last shameless plug I'll give is Wednesday, July 8th. My show starts, the Ricky Grant Jr. Show.
Oh, I didn't know
I'm
that.
gonna,
That's dope.
yes, yes, yes. It's
How
gonna
come
start.
wait, how am I finding out with the
It
rest of
just
the
look. This
people?
is new. It's new.
Nah, I don't like that.
Listen. I'm putting the announcement on your show, on the Celeste the Therapist show. I'm letting y'all know the Ricky Grant Jr. show is gonna be Wednesdays, 8 p.m. It'll be on Ricky Grant Jr. my public page. It'll be an intro and an opening monologue. I'll talk about kind of the issue for that particular episode. I'm gonna have panelists come on. We'll talk through issues. It's gonna be dope. But the purpose of the show really is to give the audience tools and frameworks on how to have these difficult conversations around some of the topics. This topic right here is gonna be something that comes up. And so Ricky Grant Jr. show. Wednesdays, 8 p.m., starting July the 8th. I'm excited about that. So, Celeste, while you take a break, I'm going to hold it down. That's all.
I know.
You take the break, I'm going to hold it down.
So they got somewhere else to go now. So that's awesome. That's good.
Word.
Thank you so much for your energy, for your knowledge. I really enjoyed this conversation. It was long overdue, and important to have. And I know that you're going to help a lot of people kind of shift the way they think. So thank you so much.
Word. Shout out to my Aunt Althea on the live. What up, Auntie? Appreciate your support. All right, good.
All right, bye.
Thank you, Celeste. See ya.
All right, so that's a wrap. That was a nice wrap to have it end this way. I think that I've been wanting to have this conversation and dialogue, and I feel like this was a very, very productive conversation for the last show, not the last show forever, but just the last show until I come back in September. So thank you guys for being a part of this journey. If you don't know, I started podcasting July 2nd, 2018, and tomorrow is going to be 2 years. And so when in March, I started coming on live 5 days a week, and it's been an amazing journey. I'm so grateful to people that have like agreed to come on and share and help us kind of navigate what's been happening. And, conversations have shifted with everything going on, and so I'm just grateful for it, because I do believe that when we start to like really think and stop and understand what's happening, we can really shift our mindset. We can't change the past. Somebody said, where is it? I love what he said. While we are products of our past, we must be careful not to be slaves of our past. And I think that whether we're talking about racism or whether we're talking about anything that we've struggled with, I'm gonna miss you guys too. Whether we're talking about racism or anything that we're struggling with, I feel that we can't change our past, but we could change our present, and we could change the direction that we're going. And that's exactly what Ricky was talking about when he said, if the least you can do is just educate yourself, right? That's the least you can do. And so I would really encourage you to educate yourself. I would really encourage you to take care of yourself and know that, it's not going to be changes taking place tomorrow, right? And so like my joy and my peace cannot be contingent upon when America decides to change the way they treat me. And so I really want you to create your peace, to create your joy. I think that's important. So where are you? You must be, where are you coming from? Congratulations. Thank you so much. It's already July 2nd where you're at. So it's the anniversary. Thank you. So thank you so much, guys, for rocking out with me. So this is going to be episode 235. Tomorrow, I'm going to post up my first episode, Who is Celeste? I'm going to repost that for the anniversary. But there's you're from Zambia. Oh, wow. Thank you for being here. I appreciate you. I have so many listeners on the continent of Africa. So if you're not familiar, I have like over 120 countries. People listen to me, and so like I'm beyond grateful and thankful for the support. So I forgot my last thought I was going to say, but you can follow me on all social media platforms, Celeste the Therapist, or go to celestetherapist.com to find me. I'm very active on social media. I post every day something around wellness. I think it's important for us to create the environment that we are looking for, or that we need. And so love you guys so much. I'll see you in September on podcast, but I'll still be on social media, but I'll see you guys in September, and I will talk to you later.
Life that I care about and love, but wait, maybe I'm getting too emotional. That's exactly what they say you ain't supposed to do. Suppress your feelings, never talk about your pain. Can't appreciate the sun without acknowledging it rains, right? That's right. So this a moment of clarity, and make sure you always protect your energy. You stay focused and your life gon' be lit. And you